Hi friends, welcome back to my channel. I'm Kat, this is Kat Makes, and today we are once again talking about Tambour embroidery. It's my favorite time of the week. As promised, I have so many more ideas and things I want to share as part of this learning playlist, and of course later we're still going to follow up with that Q&A video, and I'm basically just going to keep adding more to the playlist as I come up with more things, so please keep asking questions in the comments. Speaking of questions, this video answers the question, what do I do with it? And I'm going to show you how I've finished some of my projects in the past, but also basically I'm just going to give you some practical tips for how to do whatever it is you're trying to do with your project. I'm going to stick to things on the more wearable side, so things you can use or wear rather than wall hangings. Wall hangings is a little bit obvious. You can absolutely make all the pretty wall artwork that you like, but we're here today to basically tackle the process of getting you from the point of finishing your embroidery, so the point at which you stitch on your last bead or your last sequin, through to finishing the item that the embroidery is going to go on. As part of that, we have a couple of things to talk about, and the first thing is how do we finish it? And this is very much up to you in general, but the process goes generally something like this. Our first step is going to be to steam it and then let it dry and cool. Steaming is of particular benefit if you're using silk or a natural fiber over something like polyester. If you have any sort of like waves or a little bit of wrinkliness because you had maybe some tension issues with your embroidery, the steam will help relax the fabric and those things will disappear. This won't happen, or at least it won't happen nearly as much with a synthetic fabric, but you should steam even if you're using a synthetic because it is also going to help set those threads in place. And for steaming, you can use just a regular household iron if you have a steam iron, and hold it above the fabric. Don't touch. Do not touch your embroidery with the iron, it is too hot, but hold it above the fabric, maybe a couple of inches above, and then just hit it with the steam evenly all the way around. If you don't have a steam iron, you can use just a regular plain iron or a hairdryer even to produce heat, and what you want to do is get a tea towel nice and damp, lay it over the top of your embroidery, and then hit it with that heat from the back, and the steam will be pushed through. Then that will give us the effect we're looking for. Once that is cooled and dried, we need to consider other ways that we might want to secure those threads. You've woven in your ends already and you've cut off the excess tails, and from here, I cannot emphasize enough that you should proceed in a way that feels comfortable to you. I've talked to a lot of different people who do tambour embroidery and bead embroidery about their processes, and a lot of them are very confident that their way is the only right way, and yet their ways all contradict each other. So I'm going to give you a couple different options here, and I want you to decide based on your own project and your own comfort levels what you want to do. The couture method is to mix gum arabic with 2 parts water. So 1 part gum arabic, 2 parts water. This is a very safe substance. It's used in watercolor. It's also edible as a fun little side note, among other things, and it won't damage the fabric or yellow over time. It will wash out since it's water soluble. And basically what you're going to do if you choose to use gum arabic to finish your embroidery is you mix that concoction up, 1 part gum arabic and 2 parts water. And I learned this from someone who studied at a very prestigious embroidery school in France. So like this, I'm just not pulling this out of thin air, right? You put it in a saucer and you dip the palms of your hands and like your fingers flat in the saucer, and then sort of ghost your hands just ever so lightly over the back of the work. And the goal here is that you're only touching the threads, you're not touching the fabric, and you can just refill your hands whenever things start to feel a little bit dried out. You can go in with your fingertips as well if you're looking for like a little bit more control with the fabric, but the goal here is that we're not touching the fabric. You only want to touch those threads in the back. However, if you do touch the fabric, it's not the end of the world. Because gum arabic is water soluble, you can just go back in there with a wet Q-tip and sort of clean up little areas that might get a little bit gummy. This effectively, as the name implies, gums up the thread, and it's a great safe option as long as you don't plan on washing your embroidery at all, because if you wash your embroidery, you'll wash the gum arabic out. I actually did this for my wedding dress at the advice of that friend that I told you that studied at the prestigious embroidery school in France. And it's not what I do now, but it is an option worth considering, especially if the idea of glue worries you a little bit, but you still want to have a little bit of a safety net keeping the back of your embroidery from unraveling. The next option is glue. Glue is scary because it's not easy to get out if you overdo it, and we want to treat our pieces as though they'll last forever, which means archival practices if we can. It's worth saying that fabric and embroidery are very ephemeral processes in the grand scheme of longevity compared to like marble sculpting, for example, and a piece is only as strong as its weakest link, right? But we can take steps to make them last longer. In general, you want to look for a glue that dries clear and flexible and has a word like archival or acid-free in the name or on the bottle. The 2 glues that I use are the Helmer 450 Quick Dry Adhesive, which looks like this, and the Tambour Mono Liquid Glue Aqua, and it looks like that. Both of these I've tested on my own projects, and I think that they work quite well. They do dry clear and flexible, and I've had pieces around for a couple of years now that I've used with them, and I've not had any yellowing over time. However, I haven't had any pieces that have been sitting around for decades, and I don't know what this glue will look like 50 to 70 years from now. Related, I know that some other people use fray check. I personally find fray check too runny and hard to control, but that is an option if you would prefer something that's a little bit more on the liquid side. With gluing, you can glue all of your embroidery or a portion. I know some people who coat the entire back of their work in glue, which personally seems really scary to me. I prefer to just do some little dispersed dots on my knots and on any areas where I think snagging might be more likely. And it's totally up to you what your plan is. It kind of depends on your piece and whether or not the back is going to be protected. I tend to glue less if the back is going to be covered directly by some backing layer, and I'll glue a little bit more if the backing is going to be exposed, like the capelet that I'm working on now, where you're just going to be able to access the back of the embroidery really easily. That will get a little bit more glue than, for example, an applique project might. If you're treating it as an applique, and we're going to come back to more about what that looks like in a second, you can also apply some glue around the edges to keep the fabric from fraying if it's a woven. And now you understand why tulle is so popular, because it doesn't fray when you treat it as an applique. But if you're using something like organza and you want that organza not to fray, you can run a little bit of glue around the edges to keep that from happening. If it's polyester, you can also melt it around the edges, but you have to be so careful, because you'll either melt your thread if you've used polyester thread, or you might burn through the thread and break stitching if you're using cotton, because cotton will just burn and then disintegrate. So if you're planning on melting around the edges of a piece of embroidery to get the excess fabric off, please be so careful, okay? But coming back to securing our threads, not gluing at all, so no gum arabic and no traditional glue, is also a completely acceptable alternative. I know some folks who would very loudly proclaim that any kind of gluing is cheating, and if you're confident that you've woven your ends in strongly enough and the piece isn't going to be handled or stressed or worn intensively, then these are all considerations, right? Basically what I'm telling you here is to do what feels comfortable. It's also worth saying that the steaming and the gluing are not make or break elements, especially on smaller projects. They do make a really big difference in larger things, and I definitely recommend that you do especially the steaming for all of your larger projects. But if you've done something like a little patch or a small sampler and not steamed or glued and you've already stitched it down to something, the embroidery police are not going to come out of the woodwork and throw you in embroidery finishing jail. Don't worry. We're all allowed our own opinions about how to finish our embroidery, and I, for example, can't ever see myself coating the entire back of a piece in glue. That just seems like sacrilege to me. But like I said, I know embroiderers whose opinions that I trust do this. It just exists in the world as an alternative, and that's okay. To recap, our process in general is once it's cool and dry from the steaming, you can glue, and once the glue is dry, then you can pull it off the frame. And now we get to make it into whatever it's going to be. When we're ready to make our item, there are two main categories for its usage. You can either stitch it onto something, or you can stitch it into something. And it pays to think about how you're going to use your embroidery as part of the design process so that you're prepared when it comes time to sew the whole thing together. Stitching it onto something is easy. We're basically treating it as an applique. We're going to cut it out as close to the edge as possible and stitch it down in between the beads, focusing on edges, but also some in the middle for areas of support, especially if it's a larger piece. If you're worried about it unraveling, you can also cut it out with about a 1 centimeter seam allowance and then flip that seam allowance under before stitching it down. The benefit of that is that it adds strength and it prevents any raw edges from sort of appearing around the edges of your work, but it might be visible depending on what the edge of your design looks like, and it also can be really difficult to do on a complex shape. So those are just a few things to keep in mind. You can also stitch a piece to a backing. This counts as an applique for purposes of our discussion because we're treating it exactly the same way. In the example of my flapper headbands, I finished the piece of embroidery, laid them out on a really thin leather. That's what I was using. You could also use something like felt, and then tacked them to the leather with the glue before going around the edges with the whip stitch to secure it. It's not an applique in the traditional sense, but it's the same process. Lots of times we think of appliques as like individual little patches that you might put on a garment or something like that, but this doesn't necessarily have to be the case. I want you to sort of expand what you think of when you think of an applique. An applique in its truest form is just applying your embroidery, in this case, to an item like a garment. As an example, my wedding dress had the full bodice covered in tambour embroidery, but the embroidery was still applied as an applique. I had these individual pieces all the way around, my front piece and my sides and my, all the way around. Those were all just treated as appliques. So I pinned all of those pieces onto the finished bodice of my wedding dress, and then I went through and just hand stitched everything until I was happy with both the edges and a little bit in the middle, just to keep everything from sagging. That still counts as an applique. On the other side of the equation, we have stitching in. If we're going to stitch a piece of embroidery into an item, we want to make sure that we definitely leave seam allowance. I personally like to thread trace my pieces at the beginning of the embroidery process. That's why there are always those running stitches that you can see around the edges of my work. And that thread tracing indicates a seam line, so that's where the stitching is actually going to occur. And that way I know exactly where I can bead up to without crossing over that border, because if I do, I'm crossing into the seam allowance. When I go to cut my piece out, I'm more focused on leaving like 2 to 3 times as much fabric as I think I need for that seam allowance, because it's very easy to trim fabric away and it is very difficult to get fabric back. Then I can choose how I want to stitch each seam, trim the allowance to whatever it needs to be for each section, and I'm going to give you some examples of what I mean, because that probably sounds really complicated. As an example of embroidery that's been inserted, all of the sides are enclosed. We've got my bra back. So this is a triangular piece of embroidery that I inserted into the back of a bra, and I cut this guy out with like a 2-inch seam allowance on all sides, and then I stitched the elastic around the edges. I stitched it down by machine using my zipper foot so that I could get really, really close to the beadwork. And then I trimmed out the excess seam allowance, flipped that elastic under, and did the final pass of tack down stitch to the front by hand to secure the elastic. A really easy way to stitch with beadwork, especially for beginners, is just to flat out stay away from those seam allowances as well. In the case of my green shirt, for example, I constructed it fully by machine. I didn't have to worry about getting too close to any beads because there were no beads too close to any of my seams. But this has to work nicely with your design, and it's definitely not always possible. If you're stitching beadwork to unembellished fabric, you can usually get close enough with just a zipper foot. If you try to attempt this with a regular foot, the pressure of the foot would almost certainly, at worst, crush the beads, and at best result in some really questionable stitching tension along the edge. If, however, I'm stitching 2 pieces of beadwork together, I've got a little bit of extra width that I'm having to deal with there. I like to use the French seam technique, which is partially by machine. The first pass is by machine and the second pass is by hand. So I'll stitch by machine with about 1/4 of an inch seam allowance, so 1/4 of an inch away from where I want my final seam to be. I'll trim the fabric down, and then the second pass is done using the mattress stitch by hand. I find that this is a really lovely way to get a nice tight seam with 2 pieces of beadwork right up against each other like this. I find it gives me more control, and I like to design things as well so that things tend to line up along seam lines. So stitching the second pass by hand eliminates the risk that you might mash a bead with your machine needle, and also means that you can do these little micro adjustments just to make sure that everything is lined up perfectly. It can be really tempting to not want to take the extra time at this stage to sew your embroidery by hand. The embroidery is done, and it's so exciting, and it's almost finished, but the finishing techniques really do make a huge difference. Stitch your project by hand if it's the best way to achieve a good result. Enjoy your last little bit of time working on the piece. Enjoy the way the beadwork feels in your hands. I've done this so much, and I'm always so surprised at how luxurious and heavy beadwork feels, and it's really a lot of fun to watch it come together. So don't underestimate, a good time with a little bit of beadwork. Put on like a show in the background or something like that to keep you company if you think you're going to get bored. Finally, I want to encourage you to think about ways that you can combine techniques in these projects. My flapper dress is a really great example of this. The base section that goes along where the lower gathered section of skirt connects to the upper section consists of these beaded strips that are treated as appliques along the top. So I folded that fabric under and stitched it down to the surface. French seams by machine and then by hand at the sides, like I just showed you that little clip. And then the bottom edge is stitched solely by machine, using just a straight stitch and a zipper foot. The blue Art Deco bag is also applique along that edge and then stitched around the edges, and it has a lining, so there's no French seam required there. I just added the lining in to hide all of the messy guts. Speaking of other finishes, the blue Art Deco top also has a hand-rolled hem along that zigzag edge, and I reinforced each angle with a little teeny tiny dab of that clear glue because I had to have it trimmed so closely in order to make it look neat on the outside. So I want to encourage you to think about each step of the construction of your embroidered piece. I've shown you a few examples where these techniques are used, but really it all comes down to choosing the method that is going to work best for the individual step for the individual project that you're working on. You have so many options, right? I think I've covered everything here, but if you're working on a specific project and you want a little bit of advice, throw it in the comments and I'll do my best to help, and I can always follow things up with a future video if we come up with something else we want to talk about. And as always, please don't hesitate to let me know if you have any questions, and you can come say hi and see what I'm working on social media, especially Instagram and TikTok. Okay, thanks, bye!